and welcome to the Decolonizing Development Research Podcast. Today I'm interviewing Professor Leny Trad. She coordinates the integrated program Community, Family and Health at the Institute of Collective Health at the Federal University of Bahia in Brazil. She has an amazing research background, originating in health services and public health, with a focus on ethnography and community-based research methods. And she has a lot to teach us about decolonizing research. I hope you enjoy. Professor Trad, you have a wide range of academic interests. For those unfamiliar with your work, could you summarize your recent research focus?
Eu posso dizer que os meus focos atuais, em termos de pesquisa,
I can say that my current focus in terms of research, on the one hand, issues associated with social and environmental vulnerability and how this affects the health of population and territories. Also, my recent research is addressing health problems of neglected groups and population around the world. I have been working for over 15 years on issues associated with racism, ethnicity, and health, and finally, my studies also have a lot to do with activism.
Thank you. And could you tell our listeners why you are interested in decolonizing research? And what do you mean by the phrase decolonizing research?
Eu posso começar pela segunda parte. Por que eu estou
I can start with the second part. Why am I interested in decolonizing research? What I mean by decolonizing research already answers why I'm interested in decolonizing research. Firstly, I don't believe there is a single definition of decolonial or decolonial research, but there are some more or less convergent foundations, or at least I agree with them. Firstly, the idea of breaking down hierarchies. I think that breaking in terms of hierarchy is very important. Hierarchy from the point of view of the presumption of authority, of knowledge, disciplines, some disciplines more important than others, or with a higher status, hierarchies in relation to the geographical, spatial dimensions, countries that are hierarchically superior to others, and then very close to that, it's breaking with the assumptions, the presumption of superior or inferior knowledge. It's very closely linked, but superficially with regards to knowledge. So I start from the assumption that the research group has superior knowledge to the people in the community because they are academics, or even when we are related countries or institutional, north-south, center-periphery. The center-periphery logical itself is already quite colonial. So to break with the assumption of superiority of knowledge, a third aspect is to subvert, reflect on, radicalize and reject the idea that I'm going to work for. I'm going to work for groups, for community, but rather work with. So the principle of co-production of knowledge, know-how and practice is very significant. There are also other elements that couldn't stand out, but I would add that I think 4 elements has to do with power, with being willing to democratize power in the relationships with the research, both within the teams and with the various partners. And that means being willing to negotiate, to make decisions, to negotiate everything, even to say that the project is going to change almost radically from its origins. This is part of the colonial research, and that's why I'm interested. I think I feel very committed to this perspective.
In this podcast, we have focused on 3 key themes of research: partnerships, methods, and impact. I'd like to touch on them all briefly because they're all connected, but I know that you are most interested in partnerships. So what kinds of partnerships are we talking about? Is it just between researchers, or are we thinking wider than that?
Ótima questão. Justamente a ideia de parceria,
A great question. Precisely the idea of partnership, especially within a project that's proposed to be decolonial, is infinite. We're talking about multiple partnerships. Partnerships with the constitution of the local research team itself, partnerships that involve, in the case of multi-center projects, transnational, involve different countries, academic institutions, non-academic institutions, governmental and non-governmental, and also the everyday universe of the people with whom we will interact and that will produce other partnerships. Partnerships that will, in a way, confuses who is part of the research team and who isn't, in the sense that co-producing implies an expansion of the team, of those who do it together. So partnerships certainly go beyond the academic environment, the research center, and involves different contexts. I think the very interesting idea of the transepistemic quiescent arenas applies here. Even the founders are part of this arena.
And why do you think partnerships in research need to be decolonized?
Ok, a sua pergunta tem um desdobramento. O que há de errado com o
Okay, your question has a spin-off. What's wrong with the classical approach? I think it's easy to think about what's wrong. When I go back to my first question, my first answer. What I do understand about decolonial research, and then for each of those principles, I find in the classical way, it's opposite. The classical, traditional, and unfortunately dominant way of doing research is based on the strong principle of hierarchy, on the concentration of power, power concentrated in groups, institutions, countries, continents. So there is a concentration of power. There is a presumption of superiority of one kind of knowledge over others. There is very little willingness to give up of this power. There is very little willingness to consider the idea of balanced dialogical perspectives. So basically, I would say that a major problem is to consider that non-academics or those whom are going to study about who are going to study are at the service of research. Sorry, I just want to add to that. This assumption also occurs in international partnerships when define who will lead the research and where the research will take place. We will collect data. This same logic, in a way, in a non-decolonial research, in a non-decolonial cooperation, it is as if the teams from other countries, especially in the North-South relationship, are at the service of that institution, that group from the dominant country.
During research projects, how can we ensure that partnerships remain equitable and that we don't slide back into colonial-style relationships?
Sobre isso, duas coisas. Primeiro, nenhuma garantia de que
There are
vai se
two things
conseguir
about it.
fazer uma
Firstly,
pesquisa
there is no
dessa
guarantee that
forma.
you'll be able to do decolonial research just because you say it's decolonial, just because it's written on a paper. It's easy. Papers accept everything. It's difficult to break with a culture that is impregnated in each of us and in our institutions and in our history. So we definitely can't have the illusions that it's going to be easy and that it's enough to take decoloniality as a principle. Contradictions are always going to happen when we need to be open to them. First, we need to be interested in identifying these contradictions. We need to be interested in willing to identify each moment in which this coloniality expresses itself, presents itself, and we need to be open to criticism. At the same time, it becomes easier to talk about being or not being equitable. Perhaps this is the easiest dimensions to tackle. It has to do with cognitive justice. It has to do with the definitions of benefit. That's more difficult in dealing with symbolic violence, aspects that lie into the real of relationships, communications, dealing with others or within the team. There's, yes, coloniality is much more present, recurrent, and often these contradictions are overlooked because more tangible indicators are chosen relating to the fairness about the benefits of research, and yet relationships, communication, they are absolutely colonial.
Can you give us an example of where you have tried to establish and work with decolonizing partnerships?
Ok, eu acho que a gente tem agora esse mesmo projeto que eu comentei, o ECLIPSE.
Okay, I think we now have the same project that I mentioned, ECLIPSE. We have been learning, we are learning every day, precisely in our willingness to listen to our own partners to tell us, to accept the limits they are imposing us, which can even show when we are being coherent with what we are calling decoloniality, and when we are being absolutely incoherent. So, in the case of Eclipse, I think dialogue has been the main strategy and flexibility to transform, to change. We arrive with an idea about the event, an idea about the ethnographic of the interview itself, and this is subverted as a result of the meeting, as a result of the exchanges. I think that at Eclipse we have made significant leaps in the exercise of the decoloniality through mistakes and success, and always having or trying to pay attention to our contradictions.
In this project, we have also looked at some of the potential challenges of decolonizing research so that colleagues can prepare and try to work through them. Can differences in attitudes to knowledge be a challenge when establishing equitable partnerships?
Justo em relação a essa questão dos conhecimentos, né? Tipo, eu diria que
With regard to
esse é
this question of
plano
knowledge, I would say that this is a plan
da
of
colonialidade
coloniality
do
of
saber.
knowledge. The coloniality of knowledge is a challenge when we deal with relationship between people from universities, academia, research, and the rest of the world. There are several levels of challenge. Some of the challenge lies at, for example, the local level in Brazil. There's a phrase I like a lot. There's a lot of north and south. In other words, Brazil can and does exercise imperialist attitudes in various respects. I, as a Brazilian researcher, can and probably do exercise imperialist attitudes at different times, not only in relation to colleagues from other parts of Latin America, the Caribbean, or Africa, because some presumptions of superiority can appear, but in relation with communities. Brazil is a very unique country, and it's easy for this to happen. But when we're talking about knowledge, for example, how do we define the theoretical framework of a piece of research when it involves colleagues from different institutions, north and south? You have the question of traditions and prestige. What kind of strengths are most valued internationally? So you have the French alignment, then you have the British tradition, British anthropology, American anthropology, even the design, this idea of, again, central periphery. So the great classics, and that's the principle of ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism and Eurocentrism is something that is part of the traditional research. It's part of the traditional logic. So many times we are invited to take part in a study that already comes with defined theoretical conceptions. This is anti-decoloniality. In that space, you have to collectively recognize the capacity to experience. Brazilian anthropology is absolutely respected, valued, but is not from north. It's not part of that think of the century, of the origins, and so on. And then, not only in Brazil, we also spend a lot of time dialoguing more with colleagues from the north than with colleagues from Latin America. So I would say that the challenge here is to break the coloniality of knowledge and be open to recognize, for example, many times we are asked, how can we hear from French or English or American institutions contribute with you in a methodological level, in strengthening your research with theoretical models? What do you mean? How can we contribute to each other? So basically is a negotiation that starts from the willingness to give up the place of power and the presumption of superiority.
And what about cultural attitudes? Decolonizing research means recognizing and respecting other cultures, but are there instances when cultural difference prevents partnerships happening? How can researchers balance respecting other cultures with their own culture or their moral and ethical standards?
Isso é bem complicado, porque,
This is
claro,
very
nós não somos
complicated because,
pessoas
of course, we
neutras,
are not
nós
neutral
temos
people.
ideologias,
We have ideologies, point of views. I have a view on gender diversity or the questions of form of organization, local power, and so on. What I have noticed, firstly, is honesty. Honesty is essential, regardless of whether it's research in classical or decolonial. I can't pretend that I follow or agree with a principle that goes against my principles. Like, I'm going to pretend that I'm homophobic, when in fact I'm not. But what happens? What's our role in research relationships? We're the saviors, the ones who are going to enlighten people and bring my cultural principles. Look, you're being authoritarian. You're not allowing gender or cultural diversity and etc. In fact, within ECLIPSE, we have faced this challenge because our communities are rural communities, just like many urban communities in Brazil. And there is a great dominance of the Pentecostal religion, which is very, very conservative, which has problems including intolerance towards religions of African origin, which has problems in relation to gender diversity, and which has various other issues of various conservative things. What I have observed is that we're not responsible for pointing the finger at these issues. We need to live together collectively in dialogue, and we are beginning to realize that, and we can contribute to certain type of coexistence dynamics where collective interest, collective desire, and collective production are more important than moral, ideological, and cultural differences. So we are learning that. At the same time, we're never pretend to distort our view. But we don't need to lecture on this. We don't need to open a discourse to how horrible it is to have a homophobic position, because this happens in dialogue, in encounters, in productions, in the productions of things. We have a very specific example. We recently launched a book that was produced by one of the communities on herbs and the effects of herbs on health. And this community, at various meetings, we couldn't get more than 50 people because one group was from the Pentecostal church, which didn't dialogue with the other because there were gays there or because they were people from Candomblé, which in an African church, and there wasn't a massive presence. On the day of the book launch, the room was packed. There must have been more than 50 people, and they ranged from children to the oldest members of the community, most of them from the Pentecostal church. And it was a joyful, harmonious event, without those differences producing any kind of embarrassment or stigmatization of anyone. So it's a question that is, I think, should combine honesty of position with the humility to recognize that we are going to have to tread slowly on that ground. We won't be able to impose our point of view. And another challenge for the decolonization of partnerships can be the shared control of a project. I don't think so. I definitely don't believe that a piece of paper, a prior agreement, is going to be the magic solution to get around those differences. These conflicts, even from the encounter between cultural, political, and ideological differences. Paper is just a paper. An agreement is not guaranteed. Look, you signed this paper here, so I just want to draw your attention to that. Openness to dialogue. Humility to recognize that we are going to have to understand the dynamic more and let the community itself tell us a way to produce coexistence in diversity. I think that works more than a memorandum.
Another challenge to decolonizing partnerships might be shared control over a project. Co-creation is a common principle in decolonizing research, but sometimes partners can influence a project so much it diverges from the initial researcher's plan. So how can researchers guard against this, or is it something that we have to accept in decolonizing research?
Great. Primeiro, outra vez, a questão da coerência.
Great. First, again, the question of coherence in relation to what we are calling decolonization or decolonial research. If one of the principles is to democratize power, then control over research must be democratized. Otherwise, we are going to reproduce the same model of concentration of power. So at the same time, we need to be honest about what we can do. We can do it because we have limited knowledge, because our experience is not all encompassing, because our governability is also limited. So there are two things here. Firstly, I don't think it's a problem that a project, thanks to the sharing of power of decision makes, takes different directions for those originally envisioned. However, there are limits to this direction to the project will take. And the limits is the capacity of people involved. I can't commit to work with things, with issues that I don't have the slightest knowledge or experience of. Of course, in a co-production, it's true, you don't need to have all the knowledge. You have the responsibility for doing everything. The research team, but maybe the people in the community, and there usually are, who have the knowledge, competence, and the ability to work within wasn't being proposed, and that adds up. But there's also limits. Often communities present with these questions, challenges, and the demands that are completely beyond our capacity to deal with, to respond to, which are related to state, which are responsible that is expected from the state. So they are beyond our governance. And hence, you need to be honest. So combining openness to distribute power, flexibility at all times, to even subvert the original project, but always with honesty to show the limits that exist in that change, including financial resourcefulness in general, technical resource, financial resource, otherwise it becomes a demagoguery.
And with that, I think we've come to the end of our time. My thanks go to you, Professor Trad, for your time, to Nathália for translating, and to our listeners for their kind attention. Goodbye and safe travels, everyone.